For 148 years, she stood in plain sight. Thousands of people looked directly at her face. Historians examined the photograph, collectors reproduced it, teachers showed it in classrooms, researchers wrote papers about it, yet somehow nobody asked the most obvious question: who was the little girl standing in the background? Because according to every official record, every census, every plantation ledger, and every surviving family document, she wasn't supposed to exist. But when a historian enlarged a forgotten corner of the photograph in 2025, she discovered something that would unravel a secret hidden since the days of slavery, a secret powerful enough to erase a child from history. And what investigators eventually uncovered would force descendants, historians, and an entire community to confront a truth that had been buried for nearly a century and a half. At first glance, the photograph appeared completely ordinary. It showed a respected Southern family standing proudly in front of their plantation home. The father stood at the center with the confidence of a man accustomed to authority. His wife stood beside him, surrounded by their children. Every detail seemed familiar, the kind of image historians had analyzed countless times before. The photograph had appeared in books, museums, university lectures, and historical archives. Researchers believed they knew everything there was to know about it. Every visible member of the family had been identified. Their names were recorded. Their births and deaths were documented. Their stories had been told and retold for generations. Yet hidden near the edge of the frame, partially obscured by shadow and distance, stood a small girl whose identity remained a mystery. For decades, nobody paid much attention to her. She was simply part of the background. Historians assumed she was a servant, a neighbor's child, or perhaps someone accidentally captured by the camera. The assumption was so convenient that no one felt compelled to investigate further. After all, the photograph's purpose was to document the wealthy family in the foreground. The little girl seemed insignificant, but history often hides its greatest secrets in the details people overlook. Sometimes the most important person in a photograph is the one nobody bothers to identify. That reality became impossible to ignore in the spring of 2025. A researcher working on a digital restoration project began enhancing the image using modern technology. Her goal was simple: improve the photograph's clarity and preserve it for future generations. She wasn't searching for hidden mysteries or forgotten crimes. She wasn't trying to challenge accepted history. She was merely restoring an old image. Yet as she enlarged different sections of the photograph, she found herself drawn to the little girl standing in the background. Something about her seemed unusual. The longer she looked, the more questions emerged. The girl's clothing didn't match what historians expected from an enslaved child during that period. The ribbon in her hair appeared expensive. Her posture was confident rather than submissive. Most striking of all was the way she looked directly toward the camera. It wasn't the gaze of someone trying to stay unnoticed. It was the gaze of someone who believed she belonged there. The discovery raised a troubling possibility. If she truly belonged in the photograph, why did no records mention her? Why had nobody identified her in nearly 150 years? Researchers began searching through plantation records, census documents, church registries, wills, estate inventories, and family correspondence. They expected to find her name quickly. Instead, they found nothing. No birth record, no census entry, no mention in family papers. It was as though the child had been deliberately erased from history. The deeper investigators searched, the stranger the mystery became. Every document that should have explained her existence only deepened the confusion. A girl visible to everyone had somehow disappeared from every written record. What started as a routine restoration project soon transformed into a full-scale historical investigation. Historians joined forces with genealogists, archivists searched forgotten collections, local researchers examined family documents that had not been opened for decades. Piece by piece, a hidden story began to emerge. It was a story rooted in slavery, secrecy, power, and silence. A story that powerful people may have spent generations trying to conceal. As investigators followed the trail, they uncovered missing documents, altered records, and references to a child whose identity had been carefully obscured. Each discovery pointed toward a truth far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The little girl in the photograph wasn't simply a forgotten bystander. She wasn't an accident. She wasn't a stranger who wandered into the frame. If the evidence was correct, she was connected to the family in a way that threatened everything historians thought they knew about them. And that was only the beginning. Because before anyone could understand who the girl was, they first had to understand the world she lived in, a world where names could be changed, records could disappear, and entire lives could be erased with the stroke of a pen. A world where children born into slavery often left little trace behind. A world where powerful families controlled not only wealth and land, but also the stories that survived them. For nearly 148 years, the little girl remained trapped inside a photograph, seen by thousands but known by no one. Someone wanted her forgotten, someone wanted her erased, yet despite every attempt to silence her story, one image survived, one face remained, and that face was about to reveal a secret hidden since the days of slavery. Tonight, we're uncovering the forgotten story of the enslaved girl nobody noticed. And what happened next would change everything historians believed about the photograph they thought they understood. For generations, people believed they understood the photograph. It was one of those rare images that seemed to capture an entire era in a single frame. Historians had studied it, local museums had displayed it, authors had referenced it in books about the American South, teachers had used it to help students visualize life during the turbulent years that followed the Civil War. To most people, it appeared straightforward, a wealthy Southern family standing proudly in front of their plantation home, presenting themselves exactly as they wished to be remembered. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about it. A large white house stood in the background. A neatly dressed father occupied the center of the image. His wife stood beside him. Their children lined up around them with the careful posture expected during 19th century photography. Everything about the scene suggested respectability, stability, and social status. It looked like a family portrait, nothing more. The photograph was believed to have been taken in 1877, just 12 years after the end of the Civil War. The location was a plantation estate in rural Louisiana, a region still struggling to adapt to the collapse of slavery and the dramatic social changes that followed. Although slavery had officially ended, many former plantation owners continued to wield enormous influence in their communities. Families who had once built fortunes through enslaved labor remained powerful figures. They controlled land, businesses, churches, and often local politics. To outside observers, photographs like this one served an important purpose. They projected an image of order during a period of uncertainty. They showed families attempting to preserve their legacy in a world that was rapidly changing. The family in the photograph was particularly well known among local historians. Records showed that the plantation had once encompassed thousands of acres. Before emancipation, hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children had lived and worked on the property. After the war, much of the family's wealth declined, but their name remained influential throughout the region. Because of that history, researchers spent decades examining every surviving document connected to the estate. Letters, tax records, census reports, church archives, property deeds, and family correspondence had all been studied extensively. The photograph itself became one of the most recognizable artifacts associated with the family. It appeared so often in publications that many historians felt there was nothing left to learn from it. Over the years, experts carefully identified every visible member of the family. The man standing in the center was the plantation owner. The woman beside him was his wife. The children had names, birth dates, and documented life stories. Even distant relatives who appeared near the edges of the image were eventually identified through genealogical research. By the early 21st century, scholars believed the photograph had been thoroughly understood. It seemed unlikely that any new discoveries remained hidden within the frame. But history often rewards those who question assumptions. One reason historians valued the image was because it offered a rare glimpse into a world that had largely disappeared. Photography during the 19th century was expensive and relatively uncommon. Families didn't casually take pictures whenever they wished. Sitting for a photograph was often a significant event. People wore their finest clothing. They carefully arranged themselves before the camera. Every detail was deliberate. Because of that, researchers assumed they knew why each person appeared in the image. The photograph wasn't random. It was a statement. It reflected how the family wanted to be seen. Yet there was one detail almost nobody discussed. Near the edge of the frame, partially obscured by shadow and distance, stood a small figure. A little girl. She wasn't positioned with the family. She wasn't standing beside the children. She wasn't close enough to be considered part of the central group. At first glance, she looked insignificant. Easy to overlook. Easy to dismiss. And for decades, that is exactly what happened. Whenever historians mentioned her at all, they treated her as an afterthought. Some assumed she was the child of a servant. Others suggested she might have been a laborer's daughter wandering into the background at the wrong moment. A few researchers speculated she could have been someone passing by when the photograph was taken. None of these explanations were supported by evidence, but nobody felt motivated to investigate further. The girl seemed irrelevant to the larger story. After all, the photograph was about the family, not her. That assumption would survive for more than a century. The strange thing is that once people began paying attention to her, they realized she wasn't nearly as invisible as they had assumed. She wasn't hidden behind a tree. She wasn't blurred beyond recognition. In fact, she occupied a position where the photographer could clearly see her. The family could clearly see her. Anyone studying the image carefully could see her. Yet generations of researchers simply looked past her because they believed they already knew what the photograph represented. And that is one of history's most dangerous traps. When people think they already know the story, they stop asking questions. As the years passed, the photograph continued appearing in historical collections. New books were written, new exhibitions were organized, new researchers examined the image, yet the little girl remained nameless. No one searched for her identity. No one attempted to determine why she was standing there. No one wondered whether she might be connected to the story in ways nobody had imagined. Then modern technology changed everything. In 2025, historians began using advanced digital restoration tools to preserve aging photographs. High-resolution scans allowed researchers to examine details that had once been impossible to see. Tiny imperfections could be corrected, faded sections could be enhanced, hidden features could suddenly become visible. What began as a routine restoration project soon became something far more significant. A researcher studying the plantation photograph decided to enlarge different sections of the image individually. She examined faces, clothing, architectural details, shadows, background elements. And eventually, she reached the little girl. At first, the process seemed ordinary. Then she noticed something strange. The girl's appearance didn't match the assumptions historians had repeated for decades. The closer she looked, the less sense the old explanations made. Questions began forming almost immediately. Who was she? Why was she there? Why did nobody ever identify her? And perhaps most importantly, why did she seem so different from what everyone expected? The photograph that historians thought they understood suddenly looked very different. Because once researchers truly noticed the little girl standing in the background, they could never unsee her. And then someone zoomed in, and the mystery truly began. The secret wasn't hidden in the center of the photograph. It wasn't standing beside the plantation owner. It wasn't written across the image for everyone to see. For nearly a century and a half, the answer remained concealed in a place so ordinary that nobody thought to look there. And when researchers finally did, one tiny detail raised a question so disturbing that it would change the entire investigation. In the spring of 2025, the photograph entered a digital preservation project designed to protect fragile historical images from further deterioration. By then, the original print was nearly 150 years old. Time had taken its toll. The edges had faded. Small cracks had appeared across the surface. Entire sections of the image had become difficult to examine with the naked eye. Historians hoped modern technology could restore details that previous generations had missed. The process began routinely. High-resolution scans were created. Specialized software removed damage caused by age and exposure. Researchers enlarged individual sections of the image, examining everything from facial features to architectural details. The goal wasn't to uncover a mystery. It was simply to create the most accurate version of the photograph ever produced. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The plantation house appeared exactly as expected. The family members matched earlier identifications. The landscape surrounding the property revealed no surprises. Then one researcher began enlarging the darker portions of the image near the edge of the frame. That was when she saw the little girl. For years, the child had appeared as little more than a shadow in the background. Most reproductions of the photograph were too small to show much detail, but as the image became sharper and clearer, something immediately stood out. The girl was dressed differently than historians had imagined. Previous researchers had assumed she was a servant or laborer's child. In the years following the Civil War, many formerly enslaved families remained near the plantations where they had once lived and worked. It seemed reasonable to assume the girl belonged to one of those families, but when the photograph was enlarged, that explanation suddenly became difficult to accept. The first thing researchers noticed was a ribbon. It sounds insignificant. A small decorative ribbon tied neatly into the girl's hair. Yet that ribbon changed everything. During the late 19th century, clothing communicated social status in ways modern audiences often overlook. Fabric quality, stitching techniques, accessories, and decorative elements all revealed information about a person's position within society. Wealthy families paid close attention to these details. Poor families often could not afford them. The ribbon worn by the girl appeared unusually expensive. It wasn't tattered. It wasn't improvised. It wasn't the type of accessory typically associated with a child living in poverty during Reconstruction-era Louisiana. The discovery immediately raised questions. Who purchased it? Why was she wearing it? And perhaps most importantly, why would a girl supposedly unrelated to the family be dressed with such care on the day the photograph was taken? The mystery deepened as researchers continued examining her clothing. The dress itself appeared better made than expected. While not as elaborate as the garments worn by the plantation owner's daughters, it also lacked the rough, practical appearance historians anticipated. The fabric seemed carefully tailored. The sleeves were neatly fitted. Even after decades of image degradation, evidence of quality workmanship remained visible. Again, the details didn't make sense. If she was simply a servant's child, why was she dressed differently from what historians expected? If she were unrelated to the family, why had someone taken the effort to ensure she appeared presentable? The more researchers studied the image, the harder it became to ignore the inconsistencies. Then they noticed something even stranger. Her eyes. Photography in the 19th century required subjects to remain still for extended periods. As a result, many people appeared stiff, expressionless, or uncomfortable in old photographs. Children especially struggled to maintain composure during the process. Yet the little girl seemed unusually calm. More importantly, she appeared to be looking directly at the camera. Not accidentally, not casually, directly, as though she expected to be photographed, as though she knew she belonged there. That observation unsettled several historians involved in the restoration project. Body language often reveals information that documents cannot. People unconsciously communicate status, relationships, and confidence through posture and positioning. The girl's body language didn't resemble that of someone trying to avoid attention. Instead, she appeared comfortable, almost familiar with the setting. That detail became even more significant when researchers examined her position within the photograph. Although she stood behind the family, she wasn't hidden. The photographer could clearly see her. The plantation owner could clearly see her. Everyone involved in arranging the photograph would have known she was present. Yet nobody asked her to leave the frame. Nobody moved her out of sight. Nobody positioned her farther away. The implication was difficult to ignore. If her presence had been considered inappropriate, why was she allowed to remain visible? The question lingered as investigators continued analyzing the image. One historian later described the experience as similar to noticing a hidden object in a painting. Once you see it, you can never return to your previous understanding of the picture. The little girl transformed from a background figure into the central mystery of the entire photograph. Researchers began comparing her appearance to everyone else in the image. They measured distances. They studied positioning. They analyzed the visual hierarchy created by the photographer. The results only deepened the mystery. In traditional plantation-era photography, social rank often determined placement. Family members occupied the most prominent positions. Employees, workers, or servants, if included at all, typically appeared at the margins. Yet the little girl's placement seemed unusually deliberate. She wasn't grouped with workers. She wasn't separated from the household. She occupied a strange middle ground, close enough to suggest importance, far enough away to imply distance. It was as though someone wanted her present but not acknowledged, visible but unnamed, seen but not recognized. That realization changed the direction of the investigation. Until then, researchers had been searching for evidence that explained who she was. Now they began asking a different question. What if someone had intentionally concealed her identity? The possibility seemed extreme at first. Yet history provided many examples of inconvenient truths being hidden, altered, or erased. During the slavery era and the decades that followed, family reputations often depended on controlling information. Relationships were concealed, records disappeared, names were changed, entire stories vanished from public memory. Could that have happened here? Could the little girl have been deliberately removed from the historical record while remaining trapped inside the photograph itself? The idea sounded almost impossible. But impossible explanations were becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Every new detail pointed toward the same conclusion. The girl mattered, far more than anyone had previously realized. And if she mattered, then someone should have known who she was. Yet every official document remained silent. No name, no identification, no explanation. Only a child standing quietly in the background, staring across nearly 150 years of history, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. Because if she was merely a servant's child, none of this made sense. If she was unrelated to the family, none of this made sense. If she was an ordinary bystander, none of this made sense. And as researchers stared at the enlarged photograph, one possibility began emerging that nobody wanted to say out loud. Because if she was enslaved, why was she dressed like she belonged to the family? Finding her in the photograph was easy. Finding her name was impossible. The moment researchers realized the little girl might be more than an overlooked background figure, the next step seemed obvious. If she truly had some connection to the plantation family, there had to be records. Names leave traces, people leave paperwork, births are documented, deaths are recorded, families preserve stories. Somewhere investigators believed there had to be evidence explaining who she was. At least that was the assumption. The reality proved far more frustrating. The first place researchers looked was the federal census. For historians and genealogists, census records are often the starting point for almost every investigation. They provide names, ages, occupations, family relationships, and locations. Since the photograph was believed to have been taken in 1877, researchers focused on records from the years surrounding that period. They carefully examined every member of the plantation household. The plantation owner appeared exactly where he was expected. His wife appeared exactly where she was expected. Their children appeared exactly where they were expected. Even distant relatives and household staff could be accounted for. But the little girl was nowhere to be found. At first, nobody considered this unusual. Census records are not perfect. Names can be misspelled. Ages can be inaccurate. Entire families occasionally disappear due to clerical mistakes. Researchers assumed they simply hadn't located the correct entry yet. So they expanded the search. They examined neighboring counties. They reviewed alternate spellings. They searched nearby communities. They looked through records from surrounding plantations. Still nothing. No matching child. No unexplained daughter. No forgotten relative. No girl who seemed likely to be the person standing in the photograph. The deeper they searched, the stranger the mystery became. Then investigators turned to plantation records. Historically, large plantations generated enormous amounts of paperwork. Property transactions, labor records, inventories, correspondence, payroll documents, and agricultural reports often survived long after the plantations themselves disappeared. Because this particular family was relatively wealthy, historians expected extensive documentation. And they were right. Boxes of records existed. Thousands of pages survived. Researchers spent weeks examining them. Yet every discovery created a new problem. The records were remarkably detailed. Almost too detailed. The plantation owner documented crops, He documented livestock. He documented equipment. He documented financial transactions. He documented labor arrangements after emancipation. He documented repairs to buildings. He documented weather events. But somehow there was no mention of the little girl. Not a single reference. Not a single clue. It was as if she had never existed. That realization began unsettling the research team. Because people don't simply appear in photographs without existing elsewhere in history. Especially children. Especially children living on a plantation. Especially children standing close enough to a wealthy family to be included in a formal portrait. Yet the records remained silent. Investigators then moved to birth records and church registries. If official government documents failed to provide answers, perhaps religious institutions could. Throughout the 19th century, churches often kept records that governments neglected. Baptisms, confirmations, marriages, and funerals frequently survived in church archives even when civil records disappeared. Researchers contacted local parishes. They reviewed baptismal books. They examined handwritten registries. They searched page after page of aging records. Several children connected to the plantation family appeared exactly where they should. Birth dates matched. Names matched. Family histories aligned perfectly. But once again, the little girl remained invisible. No baptism. No church record. No official recognition. Nothing. By this point, the investigation had begun attracting attention among local historians. What initially seemed like a minor curiosity was becoming a genuine mystery. One researcher later described the experience as feeling haunted by an absence. Everywhere they looked, evidence should have existed. Yet everywhere they looked, evidence was missing. The situation became even stranger when they examined estate inventories. Estate inventories are among the most revealing historical documents available. When wealthy individuals died, their possessions were often catalogued in extraordinary detail. Property, furniture, livestock, landholdings, and financial assets could all appear in lengthy inventories. The plantation owner in the photograph had left behind exactly such records. Researchers hoped these documents might finally provide answers. Instead, they uncovered another puzzle. Several household members appeared repeatedly throughout the inventories. Former workers appeared. Employees appeared. Family connections appeared. Yet the little girl did not. Again, no reference, no name, no explanation. The silence was becoming impossible to ignore. Some investigators began proposing alternative explanations. Perhaps the girl wasn't connected to the plantation at all. Perhaps she had wandered into the frame accidentally. Perhaps she belonged to a neighboring family. Perhaps researchers were chasing a mystery that didn't actually exist. For a brief period, those theories seemed reasonable. But the photograph itself refused to cooperate. The more experts studied her posture, clothing, and placement within the image, the harder it became to dismiss her significance. She didn't look accidental. She didn't look misplaced. She looked intentional. And if she was intentional, somebody should have known who she was. That question led investigators into one of the most frustrating phases of the entire research process. They began examining family papers, private letters, personal diaries, boxes stored in attics, documents passed down through generations. Family archives often contain details that never appear in public records. Historians hoped descendants might unknowingly possess the missing piece of the puzzle. Months passed. Documents were reviewed. Correspondence was translated. Old handwriting was deciphered. Yet the same pattern continued. The family discussed neighbors. They discussed politics. They discussed financial problems. They discussed marriages and deaths. But nobody mentioned the girl. It was almost as though an invisible wall existed around her identity. Every path investigators followed ended in silence. Eventually, the research reached what appeared to be a dead end. The photograph existed. The girl existed. But history refused to acknowledge her. Researchers found themselves confronting a deeply unsettling possibility. What if somebody had deliberately removed her from the record? The idea sounded dramatic, conspiratorial even. Yet increasingly, it seemed like the only explanation that fit the evidence. Because random omissions leave inconsistencies. Random omissions leave fragments. Random omissions leave traces. This wasn't random. This felt systematic. A child visible in one of the most studied photographs connected to the plantation had somehow vanished from nearly every surviving document. The absence was becoming harder to explain than the mystery itself. And that realization changed everything. Because investigators were no longer searching for a missing name. They were searching for evidence of a cover-up. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by forgotten stories history tried to erase, subscribe now. These are the stories most people never hear. At that point, most researchers believed they had exhausted every obvious lead. The census had failed. Plantation records had failed. Birth records had failed. Church archives had failed. Estate inventories had failed. Family papers had failed. The investigation appeared trapped. Then something unexpected happened. A local archivist reviewing documents in a church-owned storage building discovered a locked wooden cabinet that had not been opened in decades. Inside were hundreds of forgotten papers. Most appeared routine. Old correspondence, property disputes, financial records. Nothing extraordinary. Then one document caught her attention. Because unlike everything else investigators had found so far, this document mentioned a child. And that single discovery would change the entire investigation. Then a locked archive produced a document nobody expected. The letter wasn't supposed to survive. In fact, somebody had tried very hard to make sure it didn't. By the time researchers reached this stage of the investigation, frustration had begun replacing optimism. The photograph existed, the little girl existed, yet every official source that should have explained her identity remained silent. Census records had failed, plantation records had failed, church registries had failed, estate inventories had failed, family archives had produced little more than speculation. It seemed as though the child had been deliberately erased from history. Then a discovery inside a forgotten church archive changed everything. The archive itself wasn't impressive. It occupied a small room in the rear section of an aging church building located less than 20 miles from the plantation where the photograph had been taken. Over the years, thousands of documents had accumulated there. Most were routine records, baptisms, marriages, property disputes, donation ledgers, and correspondence between church leaders. Few historians had examined the collection in detail, because most assumed anything important had already been catalogued decades earlier. They were wrong. In early 2025, a local archivist began reorganizing portions of the collection that had remained untouched for years. Dust covered many of the shelves. Some boxes hadn't been opened in generations. Several cabinets still contained handwritten labels dating back to the 19th century. The project was supposed to be a simple preservation effort. Then she discovered a locked wooden cabinet pushed against the far wall. At first, nobody paid much attention to it. Old cabinets were common in historical archives. Most contained routine paperwork. But when the archivist finally located a key and opened the cabinet, she found dozens of forgotten folders wrapped in deteriorating cloth bindings. Many of the documents appeared unrelated to the church itself. Private correspondence, family papers, legal disputes, letters exchanged between prominent members of the local community. As she sorted through the material, one folder immediately caught her attention. It contained correspondence linked to the same plantation family featured in the photograph. The discovery was unexpected. Researchers had already examined surviving family papers preserved by descendants, yet these letters had somehow remained hidden inside a church archive for more than a century. Nobody knew why. Nobody knew how they ended up there. Most importantly, nobody knew what they contained. Word of the discovery quickly reached the historians investigating the photograph. Within days, specialists arrived to examine the collection. The first few letters appeared ordinary. They discussed finances, agricultural problems, property maintenance, community events. Nothing connected directly to the mystery of the little girl. Then investigators opened a letter dated just 2 years after the photograph had been taken. And suddenly everything changed. The letter had been written by a member of the plantation owner's extended family. Much of the document focused on routine family matters. But buried within the second half of the text was a passage that immediately caught researchers' attention. It referred to a child, not by name, not directly, but unmistakably. The writer mentioned concerns regarding the young one. At first glance, the phrase seemed insignificant. Families discuss children all the time. Yet several details made the reference unusual. The writer avoided identifying the child. No name appeared. No clear relationship was mentioned. Instead, the language seemed strangely cautious, almost nervous, as though the writer was deliberately avoiding specifics. Researchers continued reading. The next passage became even more suspicious. The author expressed concern about future complications and warned that certain matters should remain private. Again, no names appeared. No explanation followed. But the wording felt unusual. Family letters from the 19th century were often direct and practical. This one felt guarded, careful, as though the writer feared someone else might eventually read it. The deeper historians analyzed the letter, the more uncomfortable they became. Several phrases appeared intentionally vague. Relationships were implied but never stated. Facts were referenced but never fully explained. One historian later described the document as a conversation taking place in code. The participants clearly understood what they were discussing. Modern readers did not. Yet one thing seemed increasingly obvious. The letter was hiding something. And whatever it was, it appeared connected to a child. Investigators immediately began comparing the letter's timeline to the photograph. The dates aligned surprisingly well. The references matched the period when the little girl would have been alive. The geographical locations matched the plantation. The family connections matched known records. For the first time since the investigation began, researchers felt they might finally be approaching the truth. Then they noticed something else. Several sentences appeared strangely edited. Certain words had been scratched out. Not accidentally, deliberately. Ink marks obscured portions of the text. Small sections had become unreadable. Whoever altered the document appeared to have targeted specific names and references. The discovery raised an alarming possibility. Someone had tampered with the letter. Not recently. Long ago. Perhaps decades after it was written. Perhaps even generations earlier. But whenever it happened, the alterations seemed intentional. Investigators now faced a disturbing question. Why would anyone edit a private family letter? What information had been removed? And who benefited from keeping it hidden? As experts examined the document under specialized lighting, Additional clues emerged. Faint traces of erased writing remained visible beneath some of the damaged sections. Unfortunately, much of the original text could not be recovered. The missing words remained frustratingly out of reach. Yet the surviving fragments told an intriguing story. References to responsibility. References to secrecy. References to preserving appearances. One phrase attracted particular attention. The writer warned that certain truths are best left unspoken. That sentence alone generated enormous debate among historians. What truths? Why should they remain unspoken? And who exactly was being protected? The more investigators studied the document, the less it resembled ordinary family correspondence. It felt like evidence. Not proof, not yet, but evidence that someone within the family feared a hidden scandal. The possibility that the little girl was connected to that scandal grew stronger with every passing day. Then another clue emerged. Near the bottom of the page, the writer referred to her future. Just 2 words. Yet those 2 words electrified the investigation. Because until that moment, researchers weren't entirely certain the child referenced in the letter was female. Now they had confirmation. A girl. A girl whose identity remained concealed. A girl connected to the plantation family. A girl important enough to inspire secrecy. The similarities were becoming impossible to ignore. Investigators felt closer than ever to solving the mystery. But the closer they came, the more obstacles appeared. Every answer generated new questions. Every clue revealed new uncertainties. And then they reached the end of the letter. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The page ended abruptly. The handwriting stopped. The final sentence trailed off unexpectedly. Researchers assumed the remaining text must continue on the next page. But when archivists searched the folder, they found nothing. The second page was gone. Not misplaced. Gone. Only the first page remained. The continuation had disappeared sometime during the last century. No record explained where it went. No inventory listed it. No archive contained it. The most important section of the entire document had vanished. And according to several experts, that missing page likely contained the answers investigators desperately needed. Because if the surviving fragments were any indication, the writer had been building toward a revelation. A revelation readers would never see. At least not yet. The mystery had deepened once again. Researchers finally had evidence suggesting the little girl mattered. Evidence suggesting powerful people wanted certain facts hidden. Evidence suggesting her identity was connected to a long-buried family secret. But they still lacked the one thing they needed most. Proof. And whatever proof once existed may have been written on a page that somebody didn't want future generations to read. Because the most important part of the letter was missing. When historians turned to the second page, they found nothing. No continuation. No explanation. No final paragraph revealing the secret that the first page seemed desperate to conceal. The page was simply gone. For a few moments, the researchers thought it might have been misplaced. Old archives are chaotic places, documents are moved, papers are separated, entire folders sometimes end up in the wrong boxes. It wouldn't have been the first time a historical record disappeared accidentally, yet the longer they examined the letter, the less accidental the disappearance appeared. The missing page wasn't simply absent. Someone had removed it, and they wanted to know why. The realization hit the investigation like a thunderclap. For months, researchers had been chasing shadows. Every lead ended in silence. Every document stopped just short of providing answers. Every record seemed to hint at something hidden without ever revealing exactly what it was. Now they finally had proof that information had not merely been lost over time. At least one document had been deliberately altered. The evidence was sitting right in front of them. Archivists carefully examined the surviving page under magnification. The paper itself told a story. Along the right edge, small fibers protruded where another sheet had once been attached. Tiny tears remained visible near the fold. The damage didn't resemble ordinary deterioration. It looked intentional. The second page had been detached from the first at some point in the past. The question was when, and perhaps more importantly, by whom. To answer that, researchers began reconstructing the letter's history. The document had been written sometime in the late 1870s, only a few years after the photograph was taken. At some point afterward, it entered the possession of the plantation family. Later, it somehow found its way into the church archive, where it remained untouched for decades. That timeline created a troubling possibility. The page may have been removed long before the archive ever received the letter. If that was true, the person responsible likely knew exactly what they were doing. Historians started tracing ownership records connected to the family. They searched for inventories describing the transfer of documents. They examined estate records and probate files. They interviewed descendants. Every effort focused on one question: who had access to the letter? The answer was frustratingly broad. Over nearly 150 years, dozens of people could have handled it. Family members, lawyers, executors, archivists, church officials, collectors, any one of them could have removed the missing page. Yet not all suspects seemed equally likely. As researchers studied the surviving text, they became increasingly convinced the missing page contained something important. The first page repeatedly referenced secrecy. It hinted at a hidden problem. It discussed a child without naming her. It warned about preserving appearances. Those aren't the kinds of subjects people normally tear from history unless they have something to hide. One historian described it bluntly: if somebody removed that page, they removed it for a reason. The deeper the investigation went, the more that reason seemed connected to the little girl in the photograph. Several experts began creating theories. Perhaps the page identified her. Perhaps it revealed her relationship to the plantation family. Perhaps it contained details capable of damaging the family's reputation. Whatever the answer, the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. The girl appeared in the photograph, but not in official records. The letter referenced a mysterious child, but avoided giving a name. And now the one section most likely to explain everything had vanished. The coincidences were piling up. Then researchers made another discovery. The removal itself appeared surprisingly careful. This wasn't the work of someone tearing pages apart in anger. The edges suggested patience, precision, deliberation. Whoever removed the page wanted the letter to survive, just not completely. That detail fascinated investigators. If the goal had been destruction, the entire letter could have been burned. Instead, someone preserved most of the document while eliminating only the section they didn't want future readers to see. That decision revealed something important. The missing information wasn't embarrassing to the writer. It was dangerous to someone else. Suddenly, the investigation shifted direction. Researchers were no longer asking what the page said. They were asking who benefited from its disappearance. And one answer appeared again and again: the plantation family. Throughout the late 19th century, Southern families guarded their reputations fiercely. Public scandals could destroy social standing, business relationships, and political influence. Secrets involving inheritance, race, legitimacy, or family connections were often concealed at any cost. The possibility that the missing page contained exactly that kind of information seemed increasingly plausible, particularly when historians revisited the photograph. Every new clue pushed them toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. The little girl wasn't a random bystander. She wasn't a servant who accidentally wandered into frame. She mattered. The question was why. As weeks passed, researchers built a growing timeline of suspicious events. The girl's identity was absent from census records. Her identity was absent from plantation records. Her identity was absent from church records. A family letter discussed a mysterious child without naming her. Then the most revealing page disappeared. Individually, each detail could perhaps be explained away. Together, they painted a very different picture. A picture of concealment. A picture of deliberate silence. A picture of a story somebody wanted forgotten. The theory gained even more traction when descendants of the plantation family began cooperating with researchers. Several allowed access to private collections stored in attics and storage rooms. Historians hoped these materials might contain copies of the missing page or references to its contents. Most searches produced nothing. Boxes contained family photographs, old receipts, land records, wedding announcements, routine correspondence. Interesting from a historical perspective, but useless for solving the mystery. Then one researcher noticed something peculiar. Several family members had independently passed down the same vague story. None could verify it. None knew where it originated. Yet the rumor appeared repeatedly. According to family tradition, there had once been a matter involving a child that older generations refused to discuss. No names were attached. No details survived. But the phrase appeared often enough to attract attention. A matter involving a child. For investigators already searching for a missing girl, the coincidence was difficult to ignore. Suddenly, the mystery felt larger than a photograph. Larger than a missing page. Larger than a forgotten letter. It felt like the remnants of a scandal that had survived only as whispers. A scandal buried so deeply that even descendants no longer understood it. But if that scandal involved the little girl, then evidence had to exist somewhere. Secrets leave traces, no matter how carefully people try to erase them. And eventually, researchers found another trace. It appeared in a place nobody expected. Not in an archive. Not in a government record. Not in a church ledger. But inside a personal diary that had remained hidden for generations. The discovery happened almost by accident. A descendant sorting through inherited belongings found a small leather-bound journal tucked inside a wooden chest. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. Dust covered the cover, several pages were damaged, the handwriting was faded. Yet one detail immediately stood out. The diary had belonged to someone who lived on the plantation during exactly the same period as the photograph. And unlike official records, diaries often contain the things people would never say publicly. Private fears, private observations, private secrets. Researchers knew that if the missing page had concealed the truth, a diary might reveal it. Because people can edit letters. They can destroy documents. They can rewrite official records. But diaries are different. They are where hidden truths often survive. And as historians carefully opened the aging journal for the first time in more than a century, they realized they might finally be standing at the edge of the answer they had been searching for. Then an old diary surfaced. Buried inside a dusty wooden chest was a diary that nobody knew existed. For more than a century, it had remained hidden among forgotten belongings passed from one generation to the next. No historian had cited it, no museum had displayed it, no researcher had ever referenced its contents. It wasn't catalogued in any archive, it wasn't listed in any family inventory. As far as the historical record was concerned, the diary simply didn't exist. And inside were words that changed everything. The discovery came only weeks after researchers realized the second page of the mysterious letter had been deliberately removed. By then, frustration had reached its peak. Every lead seemed to end the same way. Records vanished, names disappeared, critical details were missing. The little girl in the photograph remained trapped between visibility and invisibility, seen by everyone yet identified by no one. The diary offered something different. Unlike official records, diaries aren't written for historians. They aren't designed to preserve reputations. They aren't carefully edited for public consumption. They capture thoughts people never expected strangers to read: fears, resentments, secrets, private observations. Historians often describe diaries as conversations with the future that the writer never intended to have. That possibility alone made the journal incredibly valuable. The leather cover was cracked with age. Several pages showed water damage. Ink had faded in places, yet most of the entries remained surprisingly legible. The handwriting belonged to a woman who had lived on the plantation during the same period as the photograph. While researchers couldn't immediately determine her exact relationship to the family, records suggested she had spent years inside the household. In other words, she had witnessed everything. As historians began reading the first entries, they found descriptions of daily plantation life during the difficult years following the Civil War. The writer discussed declining finances, crop failures, labor disputes, social tensions. The South was changing rapidly, and the diary reflected that uncertainty. Families who once held unquestioned authority were struggling to adapt. Old systems were collapsing, new realities were emerging. At first, nothing seemed directly connected to the mystery. Then a pattern began to emerge. Every few pages, the writer referred to a child. Not by name. Never by name. Simply the girl. The first mention appeared almost casually. The girl was again present at supper, though not acknowledged. That sentence immediately caught researchers' attention. Not acknowledged. The wording felt strange. Children living within a household are normally acknowledged. They are spoken to, included, corrected, praised. Yet the diary suggested something different. The girl was physically present but socially invisible. Researchers continued reading. Several pages later, another entry appeared. The girl remains near the children, and yet apart from them. Again, the language seemed deliberate. Near them, yet apart from them. The description sounded eerily familiar. It mirrored the photograph almost perfectly. Visible, closer, yet separated. As though the same invisible boundary existed both in daily life and within the image itself. By this point, historians felt their pulse quickening. For the first time, they had found a contemporary source describing a child whose existence seemed intentionally obscured. The diary continued. Weeks turned into months within its pages. The writer documented family gatherings, church events, visitors, and household tensions. Again and again, references to the girl appeared. Sometimes brief, sometimes detailed. Always unusual. One entry described the plantation owner's wife becoming visibly upset whenever the child entered a room unexpectedly. Another described awkward silences during family meals. A third mentioned whispered arguments between adults whenever the girl's future was discussed. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Something about the child created tension inside the household. And whatever it was, nobody wanted to discuss it openly. Researchers began constructing timelines from the diary entries. Dates matched the years surrounding the photograph. Descriptions aligned with known events. The evidence increasingly suggested that the mysterious girl in the diary was the same girl standing in the background of the photograph. But the most important discoveries were still ahead. As historians moved deeper into the journal, the tone changed. The writer became more emotional, more cautious, more concerned. One passage described overhearing an argument behind closed doors. The entry never revealed exactly what was said, yet it recorded a chilling observation. The matter cannot remain hidden forever. Those 6 words transformed the investigation. A matter, not a child, not a misunderstanding. A matter, something significant enough to threaten the family. Something serious enough to inspire secrecy. Something capable of generating fear. The next entries only intensified that impression. The writer referred repeatedly to preserving appearances, protecting reputations, avoiding public embarrassment. The language echoed many of the same themes historians had already encountered in the damaged letter. It couldn't be coincidence. Two separate documents, two separate writers, the same atmosphere of secrecy, the same unexplained child, the same sense of impending scandal. Researchers now believed they were looking at different fragments of the same story. Then they discovered an entry that changed the investigation forever. Unlike previous references, this passage was unusually detailed. The writer described watching the girl interact with members of the plantation family. According to the diary, visitors often noticed similarities. Similar facial features, similar expressions, similar mannerisms. The writer stopped short of explaining exactly what those similarities meant. Yet the implication was obvious. The child resembled someone in the household, and not just slightly, enough that visitors noticed, enough that it generated whispers, enough that it became impossible to ignore. Historians immediately revisited the photograph. For months they had focused on clothing, posture, and placement. Now they examined facial characteristics. The similarities were unsettling. Researchers weren't ready to draw conclusions. But for the first time, a possibility emerged that could explain everything. The missing records, the altered letter, the family tension, the secrecy, the invisible child. What if the girl wasn't merely connected to the family? What if she was part of the family? The theory sounded explosive. Yet increasingly, it seemed unavoidable. The diary never stated it directly. At least not yet. But every new entry pointed in the same direction. The child occupied a unique position within the household. Neither servant nor daughter. Neither outsider nor insider. Present but unacknowledged. Protected but hidden. Included but excluded. The contradictions made sense only if her existence created a problem the family couldn't publicly acknowledge. By now, historians were reading each page with growing anticipation. The answers felt close, painfully close. Every entry seemed to lead toward a revelation. Then came the moment that stopped everyone in their tracks. It appeared halfway down a page dated several years after the photograph was taken. The writer described a tense conversation among family members. Arguments had erupted. Voices had been raised. The atmosphere was described as unbearably strained. Then the diary recorded a single sentence. A sentence that would become the most important discovery of the entire investigation. Until that moment, researchers had theories, suspicions, possibilities. After reading that sentence, they had something far more dangerous. Direction. Because for the first time, the diary seemed ready to reveal exactly what everyone had been trying to hide. Before we continue, tell us what you think was being hidden. Your theory might be closer to the truth than you realize. Because when researchers reached the next line, one sentence stopped them in their tracks. If the diary was telling the truth, then the photograph was hiding something far bigger than anyone imagined. For months, researchers had been chasing fragments, a mysterious girl in the background of a photograph, missing records, a damaged letter with an entire page removed, a diary filled with strange references to secrecy, tension, and a child who seemed to exist both inside and outside the family. Each clue raised questions, but none provided certainty. Historians were careful. They understood the danger of drawing conclusions before the evidence was complete. Yet after reading the diary, a theory began emerging that nobody could ignore. What if the little girl wasn't simply connected to the plantation family? What if she was part of it? The possibility was explosive. not because such situations were rare in the 19th century South, but because they were often hidden. Throughout the era of slavery, relationships existed that powerful families preferred never to acknowledge publicly. Some were consensual, many were not. The imbalance of power created by slavery meant that countless stories remained buried beneath silence, fear, and shame. Historians have long known that official records often concealed these realities. Children born from such relationships frequently occupied complicated positions within society, recognized privately, denied publicly, and excluded from family histories. As researchers revisited the diary, certain passages suddenly appeared in a different light. The references to the girl, the tension during family meals, the whispered arguments, the concern about preserving appearances, the fear that a certain matter could not remain hidden forever. Individually, those details seemed vague. Together, they pointed toward a possibility that explained almost everything. The little girl may have been the plantation owner's daughter. Not his acknowledged daughter, his hidden daughter. The theory immediately generated debate. Some historians urged caution. The evidence remained circumstantial. No document directly stated the relationship. No birth certificate existed. No surviving letter confirmed it. Serious claims require serious proof, and at this stage, proof remained elusive. Yet even the skeptics admitted something was wrong. The child's position within the household didn't fit any normal category. She wasn't treated like family, but she wasn't treated like an outsider either. She occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, close enough to create tension, distant enough to remain unacknowledged. It was precisely the sort of contradiction that hidden family relationships often create. Researchers began examining the broader historical context. The years surrounding slavery and Reconstruction were filled with stories that rarely appeared in official histories. Wealthy plantation owners controlled enormous aspects of life on their estates. They controlled labor, they controlled property, they controlled records. Most importantly, they controlled narratives. Family reputation was everything. A scandal involving an unacknowledged child could damage social standing, inheritance arrangements, business partnerships, and political influence. Even decades after the Civil War, those concerns remained powerful. Families worked hard to protect their public image. Certain truths were discussed privately and denied publicly. The more historians studied the period, the more plausible the theory became. Then they returned to the photograph. This time they weren't looking at clothing. They weren't looking at positioning. They were looking at faces. Modern technology allowed researchers to compare facial characteristics with a level of detail previous generations couldn't achieve. They analyzed jawlines, eye shapes, forehead structures, expressions. None of these comparisons could provide definitive proof. Human faces are complicated. Similarities can be coincidental. Yet several experts reached the same conclusion. The resemblance between the little girl and members of the plantation family was difficult to dismiss. One historian described it carefully. Not enough to prove a relationship, enough to make you ask very uncomfortable questions. And uncomfortable questions were exactly what the family seemed to have spent generations avoiding. The investigation now focused on motive. If the girl truly was connected to the family, why erase her? Why remove her from records? Why conceal her identity? Why preserve a photograph showing her face while simultaneously erasing her name? The answer may have been rooted in the social realities of the time. 19th century Southern society operated according to strict racial and social hierarchies. Publicly acknowledging certain relationships could trigger enormous consequences. Inheritance disputes could emerge. Community standing could collapse. Family divisions could become permanent. Silence often appeared easier than truth. And silence leaves traces. Researchers increasingly believed they were looking at the traces of a long-running cover-up. Not necessarily a criminal conspiracy. Not necessarily an organized effort involving dozens of people. Something more familiar. A family secret. The kind passed quietly from one generation to the next. The kind discussed in whispers. The kind everyone knows but nobody acknowledges. The diary seemed filled with evidence of exactly that atmosphere. Adults avoiding certain conversations. Children asking questions nobody wanted to answer. Visitors noticing similarities they weren't supposed to notice. Family members becoming uncomfortable whenever the girl's future was mentioned. The pattern repeated too often to ignore. Then another detail emerged. Several diary entries described disagreements regarding education. At first, researchers didn't understand the significance. Education wasn't unusual. Many children received some form of schooling. But the wording felt strange. The writer repeatedly mentioned debates over what opportunities should be provided to the girl. Why would that matter? Why would multiple adults argue about the future of a child who supposedly had no connection to the family? Again, the theory offered a possible explanation. Because if she carried the bloodline of the plantation owner, her future suddenly became much more complicated. Questions of status, questions of inheritance, questions of recognition, questions nobody wanted to confront. Every new piece of evidence seemed to reinforce the same possibility. Yet researchers remained trapped by a fundamental problem. Possibility is not proof. A theory can explain facts without being true. History is filled with convincing theories that eventually collapsed under scrutiny. The investigators knew that. They understood they needed something stronger, something undeniable, something capable of surviving criticism. The missing page from the letter wasn't enough. The diary wasn't enough. Facial similarities weren't enough. Speculation wasn't enough. They needed proof. Until then, the theory remained exactly that, a theory. Still, the evidence kept accumulating. And with every new discovery, the space for alternative explanations grew smaller. One historian summarized the situation perfectly. If the girl wasn't connected to the family, then we need another explanation for everything we've found. The records, the secrecy, the diary, the missing page, the tension, the resemblance. The problem is that no alternative explanation fits all the facts. That realization transformed the investigation. Researchers were no longer searching broadly. The search had narrowed. They now knew exactly what question they needed to answer. Not who the girl might have been, but whether the evidence could prove who she was. Because proof changes everything. Proof survives arguments. Proof survives skepticism. Proof survives time. And after months of uncertainty, proof finally appeared closer than ever. It arrived in the form of a discovery nobody had anticipated. A discovery hidden inside another photograph. A discovery capable of turning suspicion into evidence. A discovery that would force historians to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the little girl standing quietly in the background. Because theories aren't proof. And proof was finally coming. Sometimes the truth survives where documents fail. Sometimes names disappear. Letters are destroyed. Records are altered. Entire lives are erased from official history. But faces are harder to erase. And in this case, the truth survived in a face. By the time researchers reached this stage of the investigation, they were caught between suspicion and certainty. The evidence pointing toward a hidden relationship had become difficult to ignore. The photograph, the missing records, the damaged letter, the diary entries, the family tensions. Every clue seemed to point in the same direction, yet historians still lacked something essential. Proof. The theory that the little girl might be connected to the plantation family explained many mysteries, but theories are dangerous things. History is filled with assumptions that later collapsed under scrutiny. Responsible researchers couldn't simply declare the case solved because a theory felt convincing. They needed evidence strong enough to survive criticism. That search led them back to the photograph. Not the records, not the letters, not the diary. The photograph. Because while documents can lie, photographs often preserve details their subjects never intended to reveal. Using modern imaging technology, researchers created the highest resolution version of the photograph ever produced. Every visible face was scanned and enhanced. Distortions caused by age were corrected. Features hidden in shadows became clearer than anyone had thought possible. The little girl's face, once dismissed as an insignificant blur in the background, suddenly became the focus of the entire investigation. And what researchers saw immediately caught their attention. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her jaw, the structure of her cheekbones. At first glance, none of these details seemed extraordinary. Human faces often resemble one another. Similarities happen by chance. But as comparisons continued, the similarities became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Researchers began placing her image beside portraits of known family members. The plantation owner's children, his siblings, his parents, his relatives. Again and again, certain features appeared. Not identical, but familiar. The same broad forehead, the same eye shape, the same distinctive curve around the mouth. One historian later admitted that seeing the comparison for the first time gave him chills. Not because it proved anything, but because it looked exactly like the sort of resemblance families recognize instantly. The kind of resemblance people notice during reunions. The kind visitors whisper about when they think nobody is listening. The kind that creates uncomfortable questions. Researchers understood the limitations of facial analysis. They weren't claiming scientific certainty. Historical photographs aren't DNA tests. Lighting, angles, image quality, and human interpretation all influence results. Yet even with those limitations, experts repeatedly reached the same conclusion. The resemblance was significant enough to deserve serious attention. That conclusion encouraged researchers to expand their analysis. They gathered every available image connected to the plantation family. Portraits, family photographs, paintings, tintypes, anything that survived. Then they began examining patterns across generations. What they discovered only strengthened their suspicions. Certain facial characteristics appeared repeatedly within the family line. Characteristics that also appeared in the little girl. One expert compared the experience to assembling a puzzle. Each individual piece revealed very little. Together, they formed a picture that became increasingly difficult to ignore. The investigation soon attracted specialists from outside the original research team. Genealogists reviewed the evidence. Historians specializing in Southern family histories offered opinions. Experts in photographic analysis examined the images independently. Interestingly, while their conclusions varied, most agreed on one point. The similarities deserved explanation. Even those who remained skeptical admitted the girl appeared unusually connected to the family. The question was how. As researchers debated possibilities, another detail emerged from the diary. Several entries mentioned visitors noticing similarities between the child and members of the household. At first, historians treated those references cautiously. People often imagine resemblances where none exist. Yet when combined with the photographic evidence, the diary suddenly appeared far more significant. It suggested that modern researchers weren't the first people to notice. People living at the time may have noticed too. That possibility transformed the investigation. Because if contemporaries recognized the resemblance, then family tensions described in the diary suddenly made much more sense. The awkward silences, the whispered arguments, the concern about preserving appearances, the fear of scandal. Everything fit. Not perfectly, But remarkably well, the evidence continued growing. Slowly, relentlessly, like water wearing away stone. No single discovery solved the mystery. Instead, dozens of small discoveries pushed investigators toward the same conclusion. One historian described it as reaching a point where disbelief required more imagination than belief. The theory wasn't becoming stronger because of one dramatic revelation. It was becoming stronger because every new piece of evidence seemed to support it. Still, researchers remained careful. They knew public history demands caution. The burden of proof remains high. And despite everything they had discovered, proof remained frustratingly out of reach. Then something unexpected happened. A descendant of the plantation family contacted the research team. The individual had followed media coverage surrounding the investigation and believed they might possess material relevant to the case. At first, researchers weren't overly optimistic. Many people come forward during historical investigations. Most contribute stories rather than evidence. Family legends, rumors, unverified memories. Interesting but rarely useful. Yet this situation was different. The descendant didn't claim to possess stories. They claimed to possess a photograph. Not the famous plantation photograph. A different one. An image nobody outside the family had ever seen. The news electrified the research team. Within days, arrangements were made to examine the photograph. When the image finally arrived, historians immediately realized its significance. The photograph appeared to have been taken around the same period as the original portrait. The location seemed familiar. The people looked familiar. And most importantly, a young girl appeared in the image. Researchers stared at the photograph in silence, because the child looked remarkably familiar. Not similar, not comparable, familiar, as though they had already seen her somewhere before. The possibility was both exciting and terrifying. If this was the same girl, the image could provide answers that decades of research had failed to uncover. It might reveal relationships, positioning, interactions, details hidden by the original photograph. For the first time since the investigation began, researchers felt they were standing on the edge of something definitive, something capable of moving the story beyond speculation, something capable of providing the proof they desperately needed. Because while documents can disappear and memories can fade, photographs preserve moments that people cannot easily rewrite. And now, after nearly 150 years of silence, another photograph had emerged from the shadows. A photograph that might finally reveal the truth about the little girl everyone thought they understood. Then another photograph appeared. This image had been hidden for generations. Not in a museum. Not in a university archive. Not in a public collection where historians could study it. Instead, it sat quietly inside a family box, passed from one generation to the next, largely forgotten by everyone except a handful of descendants. For nearly 150 years, nobody outside the family knew it existed. And it showed something the first photograph never could. When researchers first received a copy of the image, they approached it cautiously. By now, they had experienced too many disappointments. Records had vanished, documents had been altered, leads had ended in dead ends. Even the most promising discoveries often raised more questions than answers. Still, there was something different about this photograph. Unlike the famous plantation portrait, this image appeared informal. The subjects weren't standing in rigid positions. They weren't carefully arranged for a formal presentation. Instead, the scene felt natural, almost candid. People appeared relaxed. Conversations seemed frozen in time. Children stood where they pleased, rather than where a photographer instructed them to stand. And that difference mattered. Formal photographs often reflect how people wanted to be seen. Informal photographs sometimes reveal how people actually lived. As researchers enlarged the image, they immediately noticed familiar faces. The plantation owner, several family members, some household workers. The setting appeared to be the same property seen in the original photograph. Then they saw her, the little girl. For a moment, nobody spoke. There she was again, not hidden in the distance, not buried in the shadows, not standing at the edge of the frame. This time she appeared much closer, much clearer, and much harder to explain. The discovery alone was significant. The existence of a second photograph confirmed that the girl wasn't an accidental bystander captured during a single moment. She appeared in multiple images connected to the plantation family. That fact changed everything. Because accidental appearances happen once, repeated appearances suggest something else. Connection, importance, presence. Researchers quickly began comparing the two photographs side by side. The similarities were undeniable. The same facial features, the same posture, the same distinctive ribbon style visible in her hair, the same expression. It was almost certainly the same child. But the second photograph revealed something the first image had hidden. Positioning. In historical photography, positioning matters. People stand where they are expected to stand. Family members often occupy certain spaces. Employees occupy others. Social status frequently determines physical placement within an image. That reality made the second photograph extraordinary. The girl wasn't standing among workers. She wasn't grouped with servants. She wasn't isolated from the household. Instead, she stood surprisingly close to the family. Closer than historians expected. Close enough to create new questions. Researchers measured distances within the image, compared body orientation, examined sightlines. Who was looking at whom? Who stood beside whom? Who appeared comfortable in each other's presence? The results were fascinating. Several family members appeared entirely at ease around the girl. Nobody seemed surprised by her presence. Nobody treated her as an outsider. Nobody positioned themselves to avoid her. In fact, one detail attracted immediate attention. The plantation owner's youngest daughter appeared standing directly beside the child. Not separated. Not distant, beside her. The two girls looked remarkably comfortable together, almost like siblings. That observation generated intense discussion among historians. Friendship alone could explain the positioning. Children often form close relationships regardless of social boundaries. Yet when viewed alongside everything else researchers had already discovered, the image seemed to suggest something more. The evidence was beginning to overlap. The diary described a child who lived near the family but remained unacknowledged. The first photograph showed a girl positioned close to the family but kept at the edge of the frame. The second photograph showed her integrated more naturally into the group. Together, the images created a visual story. A story that contradicted the silence of official records. As analysis continued, researchers noticed another detail. The girl's clothing. Once again, it didn't fit expectations. The garments weren't identical to those worn by the plantation owner's daughters. Yet they weren't typical of laboring families either. The quality appeared unusually high. The fit appeared deliberate. Someone had invested care in her appearance. Someone wanted her well dressed. That fact raised a troubling question. Why would a child supposedly unrelated to the family receive treatment that seemed inconsistent with her official status? The deeper investigators looked, the more difficult the traditional explanations became. And then they examined body language. Body language can reveal relationships documents never record. Who stands near whom? Who leans toward whom? Who appears relaxed in another person's presence? Those subtle signals often survive long after names disappear. The second photograph contained several such signals. The girl appeared comfortable, confident, familiar with her surroundings. Most importantly, she looked like she belonged there. Not as a guest, not as an employee, as someone accustomed to the environment. That observation alone wasn't proof. But proof wasn't emerging from a single source. It was emerging from accumulation, layer upon layer, clue upon clue. The diary, the letter, the missing page, the facial similarities, the repeated appearances, the positioning, the body language. Every discovery reinforced the last. By now, even skeptical historians acknowledged the investigation had moved beyond coincidence. Something connected the little girl to the family. The remaining question was what? As weeks passed, experts continued analyzing the photograph. New scans were produced. Additional comparisons were performed. Every visible detail received scrutiny. Then researchers noticed something unusual. The photograph appeared different from others of the period. Not because of who appeared in it, because of how it had been preserved. Most family photographs eventually end up inside albums. Frames, boxes, archives. This image showed signs of being handled frequently, turned over repeatedly, stored carefully, protected, almost as though someone considered it important. That realization sparked another idea. What if the photograph contained more than the image itself? 19th century photographs often carried handwritten notes. Names, dates, locations, messages, sometimes on the front, more often on the back. Researchers immediately requested access to the original print. When the photograph finally arrived for examination, excitement spread through the team. Because nobody had paid much attention to the reverse side before. For generations, descendants focused on the image, not the paper behind it. Now historians wanted to know whether something had been hiding there all along. The photograph was carefully removed from protective storage. Gloves were worn. Lights were adjusted. Every precaution was taken. Slowly, the image was lifted. Then it was turned over. And what researchers saw changed the entire investigation. If you're still watching, you're about to hear the discovery that changed the entire investigation. Because when they turned the photograph over, they found something nobody expected. 8 handwritten words. That was all it took to destroy 148 years of silence. After months of searching through archives, comparing photographs, analyzing diaries, and reconstructing fragments of a story someone seemed determined to erase, researchers finally found themselves staring at a clue that felt different from everything that came before. Previous discoveries had raised questions. This discovery threatened to answer them. The second photograph lay carefully preserved beneath protective glass as historians examined its reverse side. For generations, family members had focused on the image itself. Nobody seemed particularly interested in what might be written on the back. Dust, age, and fading had concealed much of the surface. At first glance, it appeared blank. Then a specialist adjusted the lighting. Faint markings emerged. Handwriting. Old handwriting. The kind that immediately captures a historian's attention. Everyone in the room fell silent, because handwritten notes on 19th century photographs often contain the very information researchers spend years searching for. Names, dates, locations, relationships, tiny details capable of transforming anonymous faces into real people. Carefully, conservators photographed the writing and enhanced it digitally. Decades of fading had made certain sections difficult to read, but the words slowly became visible. 8 words. Only 8. Yet those 8 words changed everything. Researchers read them once, then twice, then again. Because after nearly 148 years of uncertainty, they finally appeared to have what the investigation had been missing from the beginning. A name. Not a complete explanation. Not a confession. Not a family history. A name. And sometimes a name is enough. Before historians could celebrate, however, they faced another challenge. Authenticity. Historical investigations have been derailed before by forged documents, mistaken interpretations, and wishful thinking. Extraordinary discoveries demand verification. If the handwriting was genuine, it could become the most important piece of evidence uncovered during the entire investigation. If it wasn't, months of research could collapse overnight. Experts immediately began authentication procedures. The ink was examined. The paper was analyzed. Handwriting specialists compared the note against surviving letters, known to have been written by members of the plantation family. Every detail mattered. The shape of individual letters, spacing patterns, writing pressure, common abbreviations, small habits unique to particular writers. Days turned into weeks as specialists worked. The results were remarkable. The handwriting appeared authentic, not modern, not added later, original. The note had almost certainly been written during the same period as the photograph itself. That finding electrified the research team. For the first time, they possessed evidence created by someone who had lived through the events in question. Someone who knew the people in the photograph. Someone who may have known the girl's true identity. Researchers now focused on the name itself. At first, it seemed surprisingly ordinary. Not the sort of name that immediately appears in history books. Not connected to famous events. Not associated with prominent families. Just a name. A simple, human. Yet the moment historians began tracing it through surviving records, something extraordinary happened. The dead ends started disappearing. For months, every search had ended in frustration. Now doors began opening. A church ledger contained a possible reference. A regional registry contained another. A local account book contained a third. Individually, none of the records proved much. Together, they formed a trail. A faint trail, but a trail nonetheless. The little girl who had spent nearly a century and a half as a mystery was slowly becoming a person. Researchers followed every lead. Some proved unrelated. Others produced surprising results. The further they dug, the more they discovered that fragments of her life had survived after all. Not in obvious places. Not in official family histories. In overlooked corners of the historical record. Places where nobody had thought to look. One researcher compared the process to finding pieces of shattered glass scattered across a field. Each fragment seemed insignificant. Together, they reflected an image. As the investigation progressed, additional clues emerged regarding her age, movements, and possible connections to the plantation household. Nothing yet provided absolute proof of the theory historians had developed. But the evidence continued moving in the same direction. Again, and again, and again. The girl's existence was no longer in doubt. Her presence on the plantation was no longer in doubt. Her connection to the family was becoming increasingly difficult to deny. Most importantly, the story someone appeared to have spent generations hiding was finally beginning to surface. Researchers revisited the diary. Passages that once seemed vague now felt clearer. References that once lacked context suddenly carried meaning. Even the damaged letter began to look different. The unnamed child discussed within its pages no longer felt anonymous. For the first time, historians could imagine a real person standing behind the mystery. A real child. A real life. A real story. And with that realization came an uncomfortable truth. Erasing someone from history is rarely perfect. People try. Records disappear. Documents are altered. Photographs are hidden. Stories go untold. Yet traces survive. A note on the back of a photograph. A forgotten diary. A letter missing a page. A face staring out from the background of an image. History leaves clues. Sometimes it simply takes generations for someone to notice them. As researchers continued tracing the newly discovered name, they encountered records suggesting the girl's life had unfolded in ways nobody expected. She appeared to have remained connected to the region long after the photograph was taken. She wasn't merely a forgotten child frozen in time. She grew older, she lived, she left traces behind. That realization transformed the investigation from an academic exercise into something deeply personal. The story was no longer about a photograph. It was about a human being. Someone who had spent nearly 148 years trapped in the margins of history. Someone whose identity had been buried beneath silence. Someone who finally seemed ready to step back into the light. Yet the most significant discovery wasn't the records themselves. It wasn't the handwriting analysis. It wasn't even the trail historians were now following. The most important discovery was what the note accomplished. It broke the silence. For generations, the little girl had been described as a mystery. A servant, a bystander, an unknown figure in the background. Now she was something else. She was a person with an identity. A person whose story could finally be told. And after nearly a century and a half of being ignored, overlooked, and forgotten, the child standing quietly behind the plantation family finally had something nobody had been able to give her before. A name. And finally, the girl had a name. For nearly a century and a half, she had been invisible. Not because nobody had seen her. Thousands of people had seen her. They looked directly at her face. They studied the photograph. They displayed it in museums. They printed it in books. They passed it down through generations. Yet somehow, the little girl standing quietly behind the plantation family remained a mystery. No name, no story, no place in history. Just a face trapped in the background. Now historians knew exactly who she was. And the truth was even more heartbreaking than they expected. The breakthrough came after researchers began tracing the name discovered on the back of the second photograph. For months, every path had led to silence. Records vanished, references disappeared, critical information seemed deliberately hidden. But once investigators finally had a name, the puzzle pieces started fitting together. Slowly at first, then all at once. The records they uncovered didn't tell the story in a single dramatic moment. Instead, they revealed it piece by piece, like sunlight gradually illuminating a dark room. Church ledgers, land documents, community records, local correspondence, fragments scattered across decades. Each fragment added another detail. Each detail brought the little girl closer to life. Researchers discovered she had spent much of her childhood on or near the plantation where the famous photograph was taken. That alone wasn't surprising. Many children lived and worked around plantations during Reconstruction, but what shocked historians was how often her path crossed with members of the plantation family. Again and again. Across multiple documents. Across multiple years. The connection wasn't random. It wasn't occasional. It was consistent. The girl appeared in places where outsiders normally wouldn't. Near family events, near household activities, near private matters. The pattern suggested a relationship far deeper than anyone had previously imagined. As historians dug deeper, another revelation emerged. Several records hinted that certain members of the family provided support for the child throughout her early life. Financial assistance appeared indirectly. Educational opportunities appeared unexpectedly. Community references suggested she received privileges unusual for someone of her supposed social position. Individually, none of these details proved anything. Together, they painted a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to deny. The little girl wasn't simply connected to the family. She was connected to the family. And that distinction changed everything. For generations, descendants had preserved stories about the plantation owners' children. Their names survived, their histories survived, their achievements survived. Yet one child seemed to exist outside those stories. Outside official family memory. Outside the historical record itself. Researchers now believed they understood why. The theory that had once seemed controversial suddenly appeared almost unavoidable. The girl was likely the plantation owner's daughter. Not officially, not publicly, but privately, secretly. The evidence supporting that conclusion had grown overwhelming. The facial similarities, the diary entries, the family tensions, the missing page, the unusual treatment she received, the repeated attempts to conceal her identity. Everything pointed in the same direction. One historian described the moment perfectly. We stopped asking whether she was connected to the family. We started asking how anyone ever believed she wasn't. The implications were enormous. Because if the theory was correct, it explained every mystery that had frustrated investigators from the beginning. Why was she visible in the photograph? Because she belonged there. Why was she positioned near the family? Because she was part of the family. Why was she dressed differently than expected? Because someone cared how she appeared. Why did records remain silent? Because acknowledging the truth created problems. And those problems were rooted in one of the darkest realities of the slavery era. Power. For generations, wealthy plantation owners controlled not only land and labor, but also the stories people were allowed to tell. Relationships that threatened reputations often disappeared from official history. Children born into complicated circumstances frequently found themselves trapped between worlds. Neither fully acknowledged, nor fully forgotten. The little girl appeared to have lived exactly that kind of life. Present, yet erased. Known, yet unnamed. Visible, yet invisible. The diary suddenly made perfect sense. The awkward family dinners, the whispered arguments, the concern about appearances, the fear that certain truths could not remain hidden forever. Researchers now believed those entries documented a family struggling with a secret everyone understood, but nobody wanted to discuss openly. A secret standing in plain sight. A secret captured forever inside a photograph. As more evidence emerged, historians uncovered signs that the cover-up may have continued long after the original participants died. Family papers omitted references, records remained incomplete, stories were simplified, certain questions simply weren't asked. Not because descendants necessarily knew the full truth, but because silence has a way of becoming tradition. People inherit secrets without understanding them. They inherit absences, missing names, missing stories, missing pages. Over time, the reasons disappear. Only the silence remains. That silence lasted nearly 148 years. Then researchers broke it. The emotional impact of the discovery surprised even experienced historians. After all, they investigate forgotten lives regularly. Historical research often involves reconstructing stories lost to time, yet this case felt different. Perhaps because the girl had been visible all along. She wasn't hidden in a grave. She wasn't buried in an archive. She stared directly at generations of viewers, waiting, almost as if she knew someone would eventually ask who she was. One researcher admitted becoming emotional while reviewing the final evidence. For years she was treated like background scenery, he said, but she wasn't background, she was a child, a real child with a real life. That realization transformed the entire investigation. The story was no longer about solving a mystery. It was about restoring someone's humanity, giving back what history had taken: a name, an identity, a place in the narrative. For nearly a century and a half, people looked at the photograph and focused on the plantation owner. The house, the wealth, the family legacy. Now many historians saw something entirely different. They saw a little girl standing quietly at the edge of the frame. A girl who represented thousands of forgotten lives, erased by systems designed to preserve some stories while burying others. In many ways, that became the most important discovery of all. Not simply who she was, but what her story revealed. History is often written by powerful people. Yet history is also challenged by small details. A photograph, a diary, a letter, a handwritten note, a face. Sometimes those details survive long enough to tell the truth. And in this case, they did. Researchers now felt confident they had reconstructed most of the mystery. The girl's identity had been recovered. Her connection to the family had been exposed. The decades of silence finally made sense. The investigation appeared complete. Almost. Because even after all the discoveries, one question refused to disappear. A question more troubling than any that came before. Historians now understood who she was. They understood why her existence created tension. They understood why people whispered. They understood why records remained incomplete. But one mystery still lingered over everything. Why had someone worked so hard to erase her? The missing page, the missing records, the missing references, the decades of silence. Those actions weren't accidental. Someone wanted her forgotten. Someone wanted future generations to look directly at her face without ever knowing her name. And that raises the final question of this story. Not who she was, but why she was erased. Because one final question remained. Why was she erased? The greatest mystery wasn't who she was. The greatest mystery was why so many people worked so hard to make sure nobody remembered her. By the time historians reached the end of their investigation, the identity of the little girl was no longer the central question. The photograph had been studied, the diary had been analyzed, the hidden letter had been examined, the second photograph had revealed new evidence, the handwritten note had provided a name. Piece by piece, the story had emerged from the shadows. Yet one mystery remained larger than all the others. Why was she erased? Because people are forgotten all the time. Records disappear. Documents burn. Photographs fade. History loses names every day. But this felt different. This wasn't simple neglect. This wasn't random chance. Too many things had gone missing. Too many clues pointed toward deliberate silence. Too many opportunities existed for someone to tell the truth. And yet generation after generation, nobody did. The answer begins with understanding how history is often written. Most people imagine history as a collection of facts preserved forever in books and archives. The reality is far more complicated. History is created by human beings. Human beings decide which stories are recorded, which documents are saved, which names appear in family trees, which memories deserve preservation. And those decisions are not always fair. Throughout history, powerful people have enjoyed advantages that extend beyond wealth and influence. They often control narratives. They decide how future generations remember them. They determine which details become part of the official story and which details quietly disappear. The plantation family understood this better than most. For decades, they occupied a respected position within their community. Their name carried influence, their reputation mattered, their legacy mattered. Public image wasn't simply a matter of pride, it affected social standing, business relationships, and political opportunities. In such an environment, certain truths became dangerous. Not because they were unusual, but because acknowledging them publicly carried consequences. Historians studying the period have repeatedly documented similar patterns. Family scandals were hidden, uncomfortable relationships were ignored, children born under complicated circumstances often disappeared from official histories. Their existence survived through whispers, rumors, and private memories rather than public records. The little girl appears to have become one of those stories. A story too complicated to tell openly. A story easier to hide than explain. And once that process began, silence developed a momentum of its own. One generation keeps a secret. The next generation inherits it. The third generation no longer knows the full truth, but continues protecting the silence. Eventually, nobody remembers why certain subjects are avoided. Only that they are. Researchers believe that may be exactly what happened here. The evidence suggests the cover-up wasn't maintained by a single individual. It wasn't the work of one villain carefully erasing history. It was something more ordinary and in many ways more tragic. A family choosing silence. Again and again. Across decades. Across generations. Until the truth nearly disappeared forever. The missing page from the letter illustrates this perfectly. Somebody removed it. Not because they wanted to destroy the entire document. If destruction had been the goal, the entire letter could have been burned. Instead, only the most revealing section vanished. The rest remained intact. That decision speaks volumes. Someone wanted history preserved. Just not all of it. The same pattern appears elsewhere. The girl remained visible in photographs. Yet her identity vanished. References survived in diaries. Yet names disappeared. Hints remained scattered across records. Yet clear explanations never appeared. Again and again, the evidence suggests selective memory rather than total destruction. The truth wasn't erased completely. It was buried. Buried deeply enough that future generations would struggle to uncover it. For historians, this realization carried broader implications. The little girl's story isn't unique. That may be the most important lesson of all. Across the United States, especially throughout regions shaped by slavery, countless lives vanished from the historical record. Men, women, and children lived entire lives without leaving behind the documentation historians rely upon today. Their stories survived only in fragments. A photograph, a church ledger, a family rumor, a forgotten diary. The little girl became a symbol of those forgotten lives. Not because her story was identical to theirs, but because her story demonstrates how easily people can disappear when those with power decide they should. The investigation also forced descendants to confront difficult questions. Some welcomed the discoveries. Others struggled with them. That reaction is understandable. Family history often feels personal. Learning that previous generations concealed painful truths can be unsettling. It challenges long-held assumptions. It complicates cherished narratives. Yet many descendants ultimately supported the research. Not because the findings were comfortable, because they were true. One descendant reportedly told researchers something that perfectly captured the significance of the investigation. If she was part of the family, then she deserves to be remembered as part of the family. Simple words, powerful words, words that history had denied the little girl for nearly 148 years. As the story gained public attention, local communities began discussing what remembrance should look like. Museums expressed interest in updating exhibits. Historical organizations reviewed old records. Educational programs considered incorporating the findings into discussions about slavery, Reconstruction, and historical memory. For the first time, the little girl wasn't standing silently in the background. She was becoming part of the conversation, exactly where she should have been all along. The emotional weight of that transformation affected even seasoned historians. Researchers often maintain professional distance from their subjects. They analyze evidence, they evaluate sources, they avoid emotional conclusions. Yet this case challenged that distance. Because at its heart, the story was never about documents. It was never about photographs. It was never even about solving a mystery. It was about recognition. A child spent nearly a century and a half trapped inside a historical blind spot. Visible, yet unseen. Present, yet ignored. Known, yet unnamed. And through an extraordinary chain of discoveries, historians finally restored what history had taken away. Not wealth, not status, not privilege, something far more fundamental: identity. The little girl who once existed only as a shadow in the background now had a name, a story, a place in history. And perhaps that is why this investigation resonates so deeply. Because everyone fears being forgotten. Everyone hopes their life mattered. Everyone wants to believe that somewhere, somehow, their story will survive. For nearly 148 years, it seemed as though the little girl's story would not survive. The people who erased her almost succeeded. Almost. But history has a remarkable way of preserving truths people try to hide. A note on the back of a photograph. A missing page that raises questions. A diary nobody expected to find. A face staring back from the shadows. Sometimes that's all it takes. Sometimes that's enough. The investigation is over now. The mystery has been solved. The photograph remains exactly as it always was. The plantation family still stands proudly in the foreground. The house still rises behind them. The image itself hasn't changed. Yet everything feels different. Because now, when people look at the photograph, they don't just see the family. They see her. The little girl standing quietly in the background. The child history tried to forget. The child someone worked very hard to erase. The child who refused to disappear. For 148 years, she stood in plain sight. Thousands saw her face, but almost nobody saw her story. Today, we finally do.